You already took it this morning, or yesterday, or last week, a small white tablet, bitter if it hits your tongue wrong, and without knowing it, you reach for the same chemical logic a Greek physician was writing about before Rome was a city. The painkiller in your medicine cabinet is ancient, not in the way people say ancient to mean old. In the way that means the problem it solves is older than writing and the solution was found in bark. Pain was the first emergency. Before infection had a name. Before fever had a mechanism. Before anyone understood what the body was doing when it burned from the inside, there was the burning, and someone had to do something with it. Picture the ancient world at the level of the body. Not philosophy, not architecture, not the clean marble of the museum. The body, a broken tooth with nowhere to go. An infected leg in July heat. A woman 3 days into a labor that isn't moving. A soldier with a wound that closed on the outside and kept killing on the inside. These were not abstract problems. They were happening to real people in real rooms, and those people needed something that worked before they cared why it worked. Relief mattered before theory was settled. That has always been true. It is still true now. Hippocrates knew it, or whoever actually wrote under his name, because the Hippocratic corpus is a collection, not a single voice assembled over generations beginning around the 5th century BCE in ancient Greece. What it records is a body of observation, detailed, unsentimental, and frequently uncomfortable to read because it is so honest about how often medicine failed. But inside that collection, written down for physicians who were expected to use it, is a recorded use of preparations from willow, specifically for pain, specifically for fever. The willow leaf chewed or boiled or administered to reduce what the text describe in terms of heat and suffering that should sound familiar because it is still heat and suffering and it still needs reducing. Willow bark is not mysterious. That is the first thing to understand. It is not a rare plant guarded by priests or found only at the edge of a sacred spring. It grows near water. It grows everywhere water is slow and the soil is wet. It is common and it is bitter, and that bitterness is the point. The active compound is salicin. Your body converts it to salicylic acid, which is chemically close enough to the aspirin in that tablet that the distance between them is almost semantic. But in 400 BCE, nobody knew salicin existed. What they knew was simpler and stranger and more reliable than theory. They knew the body could feel it. You chewed the bark and something shifted. The heat dropped. The edge of the pain pulled back. Not always, not completely, but enough to notice. And in a world without the alternative, enough to notice is everything. So the Greek physicians recorded it. But Greek medicine was not a single coherent system, and anyone who tells you otherwise is flattening it. The Hippocratic tradition sat alongside ritual healing at temples dedicated to Asclepius, where patients slept on sacred ground and waited for the god to visit their dreams with a cure. Herbalists worked from traditions that had nothing to do with the corpus. Midwives carried knowledge that never made it into any text. The line between observation and folklore was not a line. It was a blur. Greek medicine was inconsistent, but it was not random. The physicians who wrote about willow were not guessing. They were recording pattern. This thing, applied in this way, to this kind of suffering, produced this result. That is not magic. That is the beginning of mechanism, even without the chemistry to explain it. Now escalate the body count slightly, because this is where it gets harder to dismiss. A soldier at the Battle of Marathon in 490 BCE. Blunt force trauma to the leg that doesn't break the skin cleanly but swells by nightfall and burns by morning. He has no word for inflammation. He has the fire in the tissue and someone with willow bark and the knowledge that it sometimes helps. It helps enough that he stops shaking. Whether it changes the outcome of the wound is another question, but it changes the hours. A child in Athens, high fever, the kind that climbs past reason. The physician who arrives has the Hippocratic text somewhere in his training and something from the willow in his kit. He administers it, the fever breaks or it doesn't. But the record of trying exists, written down in a tradition that someone thought was worth preserving for the next generation of physicians. They preserved it because it worked often enough to matter. A woman in labor in the 4th century BCE, with pain that has been building for 2 days. Willow preparations appear in ancient gynecological texts alongside instructions so detailed they suggest direct clinical experience. Not all of it was effective. Some of it was dangerous, but the willow was reaching for something real, and the body confirmed it, and that confirmation survived into the next century and the one after that. So here is the question underneath all of this. Why does something found in a riverbank plant, chewed raw by people who didn't know what a molecule was, match so closely with the tablet you dissolved in water this morning? Why does the chemistry hold across 25 centuries of distance? Not because the Greeks were right about everything. They weren't. But because they were watching the body closely enough to find something the body actually responds to. And whatever that thing is, it runs deeper than theory. It runs through the bark, through the conversion your liver makes without your permission, through the same pathway the ancient physician was stumbling toward without a name for it. The name came later, so did the understanding. But the relief came first. It always does. The relief came first. The explanation took another 2,000 years. Between Hippocrates and the 18th century, willow bark didn't vanish. It moved. Through Roman herbalists who copied Greek texts and added their own observations. Through medieval European physicians who worked from Arabic translations of those same Greek sources, the knowledge folded back on itself across centuries and continents, gaining variations, losing precision, picking up new uses the original writers never intended. It was not a clean transmission. Knowledge rarely is. By the time it reached rural England, it had been filtered through so many hands that the link back to the Hippocratic corpus was invisible to most of the people still using it. And yet they were still using it. In 1763, a clergyman named Edward Stone wrote a letter to the Royal Society of London. Reverend Stone had been experimenting with dried willow bark for 5 years, administering it to roughly 50 patients suffering from agues, fevers, the kind of intermittent shaking misery that damp English parishes produced in abundance. He wasn't a physician. He was a country vicar who had noticed something, tested it systematically on human beings, and then documented what he found with enough precision to be taken seriously. His reasoning included a piece of folk logic he stated plainly. The willow grew in the same wet places where fevers flourished, and so perhaps it contained something that addressed what those places caused. The logic was wrong in its premises and right in its conclusion. The bark worked. He had 50 cases to show for it. Stone's letter didn't change medicine overnight, but it put a documented number behind something that had been circulating as informal knowledge for 2 millennia. 50 patients, observed, recorded, a named person staking credibility on a claim. That is a different thing from a tradition. What Stone didn't have was the molecule. That came in 1828 when a German pharmacist named Johann Andreas Buchner isolated a yellowish crystalline compound from willow bark and named it salicin. The chain of refinements that followed was rapid by the standards of 19th century chemistry. Salicin was hydrolyzed to salicylic acid. Salicylic acid worked. It reduced fever, blunted inflammation, interrupted pain at a level the body registered. It worked well enough that physicians began prescribing it widely, but salicylic acid had a problem that became impossible to ignore at scale. It burned the stomach lining, the throat, the soft tissue it passed through on its way to the bloodstream. At effective doses, patients vomited, bled, and suffered damage that sometimes outlasted the original complaint. This is the bleakest beat in the story, and it sits closer to the invention of aspirin than most people want to admit. For decades in the middle and late 19th century, medicine knew salicylic acid worked and watched it cause serious harm. The effective dose and the damaging dose were uncomfortably close together. People in genuine pain were given a choice between 2 kinds of suffering, and many chose the compound because what it replaced was worse. That is not ignorance. That is the arithmetic of desperation, and it is the same arithmetic the soldier at Marathon was running when someone handed him willow bark in the dark. In 1897, a chemist at Bayer named Felix Hoffmann acetylated salicylic acid, producing acetylsalicylic acid, a modification that buffered the compound enough to move it through the digestive system with significantly less damage while preserving the therapeutic effect. Bayer named it aspirin and began selling it in 1899. The credit for that acetylation has been disputed. A chemist named Arthur Eichengrun claimed for decades that the work originated with him and that the historical record had been altered. The dispute was never cleanly resolved, and any honest account acknowledges it. What isn't disputed is the chemistry. Acetylsalicylic acid is what's in the tablet, and its relationship to the willow is not metaphorical. It is molecular. The bark, the salicin, the acid, the acetylation. One line. Interrupted by 2,000 years of people who knew the effect without the explanation, and a final century of people who had both. Here is what that means for the obvious reading of this history. The easy version is that ancient people suffered through ignorance, reaching blindly for remedies that only sometimes worked until modern chemistry arrived and fixed it. That version is wrong in the most important direction. The Greek physicians were not guessing. They were observing pattern under constraint. Edward Stone's 50 patients were not anecdote. They were methodology assembled without a laboratory. The chemists of the 1820s were not correcting a superstition. They were isolating what the willow had always contained. The ignorance was never about whether the bark worked. It was about why. And the why, when it finally arrived, confirmed the observation rather than replacing it. The body knew before the mind had the language. That is a strange kind of knowledge, and it is the oldest kind there is. So go back to the medicine cabinet. The small white tablet on the shelf. Bitter if it dissolves wrong. Ordinary enough that you stop seeing it. What you are holding is acetylsalicylic acid. What you are holding, a step removed, is salicin. What you are holding, 2,000 years removed, is the same riverbank compound a Greek physician administered to a fevered child in Athens while the city was still building the Parthenon. The chemistry held. The need never changed. Human beings have been in pain for as long as there have been human beings. And for nearly as long, they have been looking for something, anything that makes it less. That search is not weakness. It is the most consistent thing our species has ever done. The bark was a beginning. The tablet is where that beginning arrived. And somewhere between the two is every person who chewed the bitter thing because the alternative was to simply endure.